terms for it, but who's heard of that parable before? Everybody heard of it? It's an interesting one because things aren't as they seem. And I think a lot can be said of just taking Jesus at his word instead of interjecting like what our thoughts are. And so I think tonight this is something that God pointed out to me. I really was not gonna preach on this, but this is something God has brought to me, and it kind of goes along with everything that he's been speaking to me today. So if you would, let's go to Luke chapter 16, verse 1. And it says, and the version that I have here is, I gotta look at the back because they're so similar. This is the ESV. On my phone I have the NKJV, and they're pretty similar. But read along with me. It says, verse 1, he also said to the disciples, he being Jesus, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. Okay, he's wasting his goods. And he called to him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. So the manager is getting fired. Okay? And the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So the manager's getting fired, and now he has an idea of what to do, okay? And he says, so summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down and quickly write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. And then he told him to take his bill. He said to him, take your bill and write down 80. And the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. This is true today too. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteousness, of unrighteous wealth. So words of Jesus, people, this is a little confusing for me. If it's not confusing for you, I don't know if we're reading the same word, but that's what Jesus says. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Okay. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or God and mammon. Okay, let's pause right there. Very famous line, can't serve God or money. But right before that, we have this very interesting parable where we have this dishonest manager. And I want to know, first off, what are your feelings about this story? Because it is important that we talk about what we feel like and what we think is happening. And then let's uncover, and I'll give you a little historical context and some things to think about. But at face value, what does this look like? Does it look like Jesus is commending somebody's dishonesty? What do you think? What are your thoughts? People, don't be afraid. It's okay. You're, it's confusing, yes. Why is it not? Oh, maybe the battery's dead. Oh, are you talking, so is he, I was a little confused about your question. So is he talking about the go? Yeah. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. You're connecting the righteous to me. I think, well, I'll tell you what I think here in just a second, but I think that's a great question because we're talking about what is really being commended here. Is unrighteousness being commended? Surely not. That wouldn't go along with Jesus, and it's not. But it's definitely not the situation. And I guess we're going to get into a little bit of a financial class, just a little bit. Most of you, Sister Joan, I know she knows more than I do in this subject, but everybody, we can all learn a little bit right here, and we can take this because I think the meat of what this is talking about has a lot of application for today. I mean, I think there's a huge application in what Jesus is talking about, but it's very easy to miss out. And so the first thing that I want to really clarify, and I want to tell you about this concept, and this is not a Christian concept, but it's called arbitrage, okay? If you don't know, does anybody know what arbitrage is? Arbitrage is a word to describe what happens in the majority of stores and sales, okay? Arbitrage is simply taking something at one price, marking it up, and selling it for a higher price. It's how stores and people stay in business. Very simple concept. And it can be applied in a lot of different ways, especially now with the internet, my word. And arbitrage in itself, there's nothing dishonest about it, okay? If there was, I would not be a good guy because I do real estate arbitrage, okay? But that's not the point of really what I'm telling you about, but it's important for you to understand arbitrage because what's happening right here in this situation is the master commends the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Now, he's not commending his unrighteousness, okay? Shrewdness is not unrighteousness. All right, I think that's something that sometimes we can talk about. Man, I feel like sometimes, people can look at someone and think maybe because they've done well or something, they had to have done something unrighteous. They had to have scammed somebody. There has to be something going on. But a lot of times, behind a lot of good ideas, behind a lot of wealthy people, and behind a lot of scammers too, is shrewdness. But shrewdness in itself is not unrighteousness, okay? Otherwise, Jesus would have connected the two, and he would have blessed him for his unrighteousness. But that's not what's going on here. What's really happening here is Jesus is talking to us about something that is he's talking to us about the meat and potatoes of daily life. He's dealing with actual issues, which is something that a lot of churches and Christians and believers, we don't actually want to deal with issues. Because when we deal with issues, then we have to talk about the reality of what it is that we believe. Because I can say I love Jesus all day long, right? But how do you know that I love Jesus? You know that I love Jesus by what my life looks like, right? If I love Jesus, then I probably want to be spending time in his word. If I love Jesus, I'm probably going to be giving to his cause, right? So I'm going to be putting my money, I'm going to be putting my time, effort, and I'm going to be putting my talent in what Jesus tells me to do because I love Jesus. Now, I can say that I love Jesus, but really, how you know I love Jesus is how Jesus said, by the fruit of my life, by what is produced, the product of my life. And this story really isn't all that different, except Jesus is applying to the money situation. He's getting into our finances here. And it's really important that we look at this and understand what's going on. So in Jewish culture, not just in Jewish culture, in Old Testament law, God, being a good God, he put limits on things. And man, I wish we ran things. You know, if we ran things the way we would according to God's law, there would not be 30-year mortgages. There wouldn't be a ridiculous $2 trillion national debt. Wouldn't happen. You know why? Because in God's law, guess what? 7 years, it's all wiped out. It's a clean slate. But needless to say, people are people, and the Jewish people, you know, here's the thing, if you look at rules in the Old Testament, there's rules against basically overcharging interest, things like that. And so how do you get around overcharging interest? How do you get around that? Well, you raise the cost of the product, right? So you overcharge on the product because that's not in the rules. Because, you know, inflation, all those things, right? So what happened, what you had in Jewish times, and how people would get around this, you know, whole debts being written off at 7 years and things like that, is you'd have markups on goods. You'd have markup on things like that. And so the debt, you know, even though they couldn't charge a ton in interest, even that wasn't the way of making money. The way of making money was to raise the price. And so what we have here with this dishonest manager is we have a spread, right? Now, I don't think this goes into all of his unrighteous dealings, okay? I don't think the unrighteousness was all because he was profiting off of his owner's goods. I don't think that. I think he was probably bad at management. This is why he's getting fired. He's probably, if his owner's making money, he's probably not getting fired because he's making his owner money in some kind of weird way. That's usually not how real life works. Real life works is you're fired because you're not the best at your job, and you're probably doing some funny things on the side. And so this is one of those funny things, but really what we see here is when the manager goes to the debtors of his boss, he tells them to cut the price. Now, at face value, what does that look like? Looks like he's ripping off his boss, right? He's offering an unjust discount. But really, what's happening is he's cutting out his price, and he's selling it to him for what the actual cost is. That's the difference. And so all of a sudden, he's able to make all these friends. Because of what? Because he cuts out his own price. He gives them this discount by eliminating what he's going to make because he's getting fired. And he needs a place to go. And what are you going to do? How are you going to go anywhere? Right? You're going to go somewhere if you make friends and have people that like you, because you have to have some kind of positive story, because what happens otherwise, they're going to say, well, if you want to manage my stuff, how are you going to manage my stuff when you just got fired from Joe? He said, you know, you were working for him. How are you going to come manage for me now, right? And so what happens is this guy comes up with a very creative solution by cutting out what is owed to him. If We look at Jewish times. You know why the Jews in Jesus' day and age hated tax collectors? Because that thing called arbitrage, remember? Not only is the tax collector working for the Romans, the guys that came and took over their land, but the tax collector is charging them above and beyond what the Romans would and pocketing off that. Now, we can have our own thoughts. Most of us would say that person's a backstabber, right? That person's good for nothing. That would put us in the majority with the majority of Jesus' population there. The majority of the Jews would think the same thing. In fact, I like has anybody watched the show The Chosen? There's a whole deal where they confront this issue of the tax collector, Matthew, and him coming, and the other disciples not wanting to receive him. And I think that there's probably, they probably are hitting on some truth. Yes, that's outside of the Bible, but we know people, right? We know our feelings. We know how we would relate to these things. And so, obviously, there's a dislike of tax collectors because of the way they handled themselves. And what Jesus says here in verse 10 is very interesting to me. He says, one who is faithful, verse 9. It says, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Isn't that interesting? Jesus isn't saying, he's not commending unrighteousness here. But he's dealing with the real hard, raw facts of life. Hey, if you're making gains, if you're making unrighteous gains, and you're going about this in a way where you're defrauding people and everything, guess what? Your wise move is to extend mercy to people in those situations. Extend grace by cutting yourself, by pushing some of that fat away from yourself and giving it back to those people who are literally, supporting your existence. And he says what happens is that when doing so, you're going to make friends, right? Now, I know that's a little bit of Devon. There's a little bit of Devon there. But there's a lot of scripture in that, too, as far as what is actually the meat of being said. But when I look at this story at first glance, I say, what in the world, Lord? Here we have this dishonest manager, and here you say, and then in the next verse you say, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. And what Jesus is getting at is a point of faithfulness, which is not unrighteousness, and getting at a point of how we can be dishonest in very little, how we can make excuses on getting around and doing things that are sly or unhanded, and how it's easy to write it off as something that we've earned. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, isn't that interesting? In verse 11, he says, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? So he's saying if you haven't been faithful in doing the unrighteous things. Jesus is he's dealing with some very real issues here. He's getting down to the P's and Q's. He's getting down to really how we make a living, or really what our life is all about. Because the truth of the matter is, every day in our jobs, in everything we do, we have a choice. Now, a workman is worth his wages. I totally believe that. And I think there's a lot of people who get ripped off of those wages, and a lot of people who sell themselves short and cause themselves problems by not valuing their work properly. But there's a difference between being a workman that's worth his wages and someone who is willing to honor God even in the little things. Let me give you some real examples that I've had to have this question and I've had to talk with God about, because I am in real estate, and so it's not really that much different than a lot that we read in the Bible. It's really not that much different. What I do isn't too much different than what this manager did. So I can relate to this guy, except I'm not collecting wheat and barley and things like that. I'm dealing with property. But I've had situations. I had a situation a few years back where I was able to get an amazing deal on a house. I was able to get it, I'm going to be honest with you here, church, be honest. I was able to get it for basically less than 50%, okay, of what this house is worth. Well, less than 50% of what I sold it for 3 years ago, actually significantly less than that. But the whole reason that I was able to get this deal is because I was able to work out a situation with the owner where she could live there in the house. She could pay me below market rent. And that was fine. We're fine to do that, and she could do it for as long as she wanted to. We didn't have any, we had a unlimited term. I told her, hey, just as taxes go up, we'll adjust it 3% for whatever, for the, for our expenses every year. And so we had a very agreeable arrangement for her. It was very great for me. I didn't make any money on the front end of that deal. I could have turned around and sold it, and there would have been money made, but I didn't do that. I wanted to do right by this lady. Come time for COVID, she gets into a bind. She can't pay for almost a year, okay? And, but then the bind gets real, okay? And so there's an option, and she had gotten behind. We'd helped her, got behind, all this stuff, and we're getting to a point where, there's a moratorium on evictions, and man, she's behind, we're getting up there in the thousands of dollars. And I'm just thinking to myself, there's no way that she's going to be able to come back and pay this off. And so what we could have done is we could have evicted her and put charges on and, did whatever we could do to get her money. I'm not about that. Even though that's okay, and I had expenses and I lost money on that. What we decided to do was to offer her the chance, and I was even going to offer her some, my partner, we were talking about it, I was saying, hey, we should, give her something, but what we ended up doing was giving her more free time to stay at her house, rent-free, okay, until she could find a place. And to make a long story short, we were able to do that and then turn around and sell the house for way more than what we had originally bought it for and that's after putting quite a bit of money into it to bring it up to speed and sell it. But the reason that I tell that story, the reason is because when you have bills to pay and you got a mortgage company calling you and saying, hey, when are you going to pay? And you don't have someone there to pay it because I don't have cash. I can't just, the way my business work is not cash. It's taking loans from different people and trusting that everything's going to be okay and that people are going to pay and having some fallback and making some calculations ahead of time and then praying about it. Because if you don't pray about it and ask God, you can get yourself into a real pickle. And boy, am I being open and honest tonight. I'm just letting you guys know how things work. But the point of what I'm saying is it's very easy to say, you know what? It would have been very easy earlier on in our dealings with this person to just sell this, make the huge gain, which at the time I needed the money. Not gonna lie. I didn't make anything in the acquisition of this property. It would have been very better. And even my dad, who's here, was like, you're not going to make anything. Why are you buying this place? Why are you doing this deal? But, I prayed about it. And I knew, even though it didn't make sense on the front end, I trusted that God was going to make it right on the back. And that's called, and I'm not trying to make myself out to be Jesus, because Lord knows I've messed some other things up, okay? But this is just credit to him, because it did make sense to me at first, but it ended up working out to where, this this deal actually, I mean, it saved me. It did not just save me, but it helped me out in a huge way economically during a very rough time where other people were struggling and other people that I knew in the business were not being able to do it and trying to figure out other things to do. God provided for me. But that only happened because I was willing to go along with his plan. And his plan wasn't necessarily shrewd for the time being. Because I got that shrewdness. Boy, I could be that. I'm telling you what, church, I could be the dishonest manager. I have some acumen. And I remember when I was a youth pastor thinking, Lord, if I could just have some freedom to do my own thing, boy, I'd show you. Well, the Lord had to let some business failures happen so he could show me, hey, you know what? The world does not spin when you tell it to spin, buddy, you know. You may have your great ideas and thoughts about things, but I am God, and I am your provider. And you know what? We either believe that or we don't, church. And that's really what this gets down to. If we're honest in our management, if that manager would have been honest in all of his dealings, would he have still had a job? Yes, but even when he brought a little bit of God's principle into the equation, boom, opportunities are made. I don't know if you realize that, but that's really what is at the crux of this message. When we bring what God tells us to do, when there are biblical principles. I was listening to R.C. Sproul talk about this very thing, and he really connected it to tithing, and I don't think it totally connects to tithing, but I can see the connection that he was making. But he was talking about unbelievers who tithe because they understand God's principle. They don't believe in Jesus. They don't serve Jesus, but they know that he'll bless you if you tithe.
That's true.
And
I know there are people who pay tithes, but he bless them.
yeah, I know people, there's people in real estate groups and business groups that I've talked to, they're like, tithing, you have to do it. If you don't do it, your business will not go well. And I mean, these people, they don't go to church. They don't, they don't talk like a believer, but they sure understand this one principle. And it's funny how we can take principles that are God's, and even if everything else isn't, fixed in our life, when we take God's word and we inject it into a situation, how that situation has changed. And this is what Jesus is talking about. This is what he is getting at. He's dealing with the issues of the heart and this love of money, but he's also dealing with hey, when you do things that I say, that I tell you to do it, guess what? It will go better for you. Now, does sometimes that look like not being shrewd? Yes. Sometimes it does. It looks like the opposite. Sometimes it looks like foolishness. So what Jesus said, he tells us that he confounds the wisdom of this world with what the world would consider foolishness, right? But it's not foolish when we're considering the fact that this is God's direction. And so there's things. There's things that I've learned too, especially in the industry that I'm in real estate. There's a lot of people who get sued. And what I've found in doing a lot of research, and I'm about to have to do some continuing education on legal updates, fun stuff. But what I've found is a lot of times in these situations where there's legal troubles, a lot of it boils down to people not treating other people the way that they know they should and doing wrong. And so I've found that even in situations that are extremely difficult, and I'm talking about telling people, hey, you can't live in your home that you've lived in for years anymore because you can't pay your bills, and I can't afford to let you live there for free. And God still works it out. Last week I had to do that, and it wasn't not an easy deal, but it's crazy because the people that I was dealing with at the time, these people are in the process of losing their home, even though I'd given them some advice on selling it and trying to push that. and trying to do other things, and there's not listening to me, which is frustrating. I've learned that how God must feel a lot of times trying to tell people what to do or trying to tell me what to do, and I'm not listening, and he knows that I'm about to learn a difficult lesson. But even in that, in dealing with kindness with people in the midst of their difficulty that they did not bring about on their own, but in dealing with that, having people, look at you and understand that you care for them, and it's crazy. I mean, I don't think there's been too many banks that have foreclosed on people, and the people that are living there say, hey, we'll be sure to clean the carpets. And I'm like, don't worry about cleaning the carpets. But this is, I'm telling you, a real situation here, church. It's not easy. But this is reality. And this is what Jesus is dealing with in this very parable. And in let's look down here. In verse 12 it says, and if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God. You cannot serve God and money. Now in this situation, this is very easy for the listeners to understand, because in that time there was literally slave auctions going on. And so can you imagine being at an auction and two guys bid, and the auctioneer says, hey, I got an idea. This person will just serve both. Can you imagine? That's not going to work. It ain't going to work, all right? Because what if they disagree? It is impossible. That situation does not work. And God is saying, guess what? You got to choose who you're going to serve. You cannot serve money and then have me on the side, okay? And so what it boils down to, this last verse shows the issue that's happening with this dishonest manager. It shows the issue that's happening, and it happens with a lot of us, is this choice of, are we going to serve God in everything? Because if I honor God in everything, that's going to cost me. And it has. And I've had to learn there's some businesses, things I can't do because I couldn't make money. I would literally die helping people. And that's one of those areas where you got to ask the Lord, what is it that you want me to do? Because when we do what God tells us to do, then things seem to change. And in verse 14, now here's the people who are listening to what Jesus is saying here. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money. Look at this. Supposedly men of God, among the Jews of the time, these are considered the most righteous. And Jesus says the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. Okay? And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Now this is where the rubber meets the road. And I know this extends out of that parable, but really this is what Jesus is. This is the crux of the matter. This is really what he's getting at. It says the law and the prophets were until John, since the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it, but it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Okay? Why is Jesus making the point about the law being void? Why is he making not being void? Why is he making this point about the law being something so powerful? You know why? Because if we look at the law, guess what? We are all condemned. Jews who believe that they can abide by the law today, I'm like, wow, you've got some strong faith. or you must be lying to yourself something big. Because there's no way that you can abide by that law. There isn't. The whole point of the law is not to show you this is what you have to do to be faithful. The point of it is for you to look at it and say, wow, there's no way that I'm going to make that. It's like me measuring the distance of the Grand Canyon and coming back, at the widest point, and then coming back to you and saying, well, it's only, this wide. Get on your bike, and if you back up really far, it is. It's like trying to jump the Grand Canyon with a bicycle. That's the point. The law, the purpose of what Jesus is saying, and he gets right into it too afterwards. He starts to deal with other things because that's what Jesus meddles. He does. He opens, and that's the thing is when we get close to the Lord, if we get within talking distance where we can hear Jesus, I can guarantee you he's going to start to point out some issues in your heart, and he's going to point to the core of it. In verse 18, he says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. The whole purpose of this is because you have guys there who are just divorcing because they just feel, she didn't make the eggs right today. That was literally the thought of this. People take this, they twist it into a lot of different things. But when you look at culturally, the two schools of thought of the time, one was that, hey, you only divorce, there's been unfaithfulness. Now, this does not apply to abuse, okay? Abuse, Jesus does not support abuse. He's not telling anybody to stick it out and abuse. That's a misread, and that's sadly there's a lot of ignorance, and we don't have everything all together. And that's what the first story is actually pointing out, is that even the unrighteous man did something right in his shrewdness in giving those people that discount, made friends. See, this is the point. The point is when we take God's word and we apply it to our life, it blesses us and it blesses those around us. And Jesus is trying to make a point to these people that you don't know God. You know how I know you don't know God? Because you were very flippant on one of the first things, on literally one of the first institution that he created, the family. All right, you're flippant about breaking that off. You don't treat it with honor, is what Jesus is saying.
Devon?
Yes.
We must, when we see this up there, whosoever divorces his wife and marry another commits adultery. And whosoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, I have dealt with people who become very sad with this, and I told them, if you've done this in sin, and you did not know the Lord,
Yeah.
you're forgiven.
That's we believe that too. Because who is Jesus talking to right here?
He's talking to the church.
He's talking directly to Pharisees. Plus, the Lord also says that, all things are made new when we come unto him.
I had people, tell me, well, I was divorced and I married this woman, she was divorced, and
Yeah.
how about, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, were you saved? Did you know anything about the Lord? And we didn't know nothing about the Lord. I
Yeah.
said, well, only now that you're in the Lord and you understand it, then your life has to obey the word.
Well, and what Jesus is saying here, look, Old Testament law, see a lot of these guys, they go back to Old Testament law, which says you can issue your wife a certificate of divorce. Old Testament law permitted divorce, okay? And what Jesus is saying here is that no. You don't just get to divorce your wife all willy-nilly because she made the eggs wrong, or because, whatever reason that you want to just flippantly come up with. No. There's got to be something where the institution has been jeopardized.
Today we've got a lot of people
Yes.
that are married.
Yes.
I know some.
Yeah. No. We do. But the thing is that Jesus is not. he's elevating our role. What is our role? And you know what? I'm telling you what, there's a lot of people who make excuses for just wanting to get out, and then there are people who are genuinely betrayed by that spouse. And there is a difference. There's a difference between a betrayal. You can come back. There's a difference between sin unto death, and then there's a difference between sin that does not lead unto death. And in the same way, that's how it is for remarriage. But the point with this is that marriage is a holy institution created by God. We should treat it with honor and respect and see what he says, because God didn't just divorce his people. Man, I'm telling you what, the Lord has had opportunity after opportunity to divorce his people, but it wasn't until they completely abandoned him and turned to other gods that he says, you know what, I'm going to issue you a certificate of divorce, which I find is interesting, because for number one, God issues his people a certificate of divorce, showing us that sometimes people are going to be so stubborn, there is a reason for it. But number two, God also shows us that faithfulness sticks it out. Faithfulness, you're going to stick it out with those people. Now, there is going to be times where you're going to have to draw a line, and God says that line, Jesus makes it clear that line is adultery, and we could get into a whole topic I really don't want to because it's a long topic. I've looked at this for a long time. But the point of this is Jesus is saying, you don't care about what I care about. What I say is important, you treat as flippant. That's what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. And then he goes on to tell about the rich man Lazarus, all right, who knows better after he died. We could read this real quick, and I'm sorry I'm going on. I know I said Dad was going to sing some songs, and we will. But it says in verse 19, it says, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. This man lived a good life. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by angels to Abraham's side. I'm telling you what, the nice thing about this story, man, it makes you look forward to heaven. And I'm telling you what, some of us, sometimes we just need to stop thinking about what's going on in this world and start thinking about everything that we have to look forward to, especially when we're doing things God's way and we think things are going not as what we planned. But he says, the rich man had also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes, and he saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water and cool my tongue, for I'm in anguish from this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he's comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And then he said, then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham says, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear. And he said, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, then they will repent. He said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they become convinced. Neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. And boy, that is powerful. Now, I'm sorry that I like to read the whole chapter, but there's a reason to this, and I think it's really good because it gives us context of really what's going on. Because when we look at what Jesus started out with the story of the unworthy servant, what is Jesus saying throughout all this? He's saying, guess what? My word is either important to you or it's not. And if you value my word, even in unrighteousness, you will be blessed. Did you catch that? Even when the man, even though he was unrighteous, even though he's getting fired, he takes a principle from Jesus' playbook, which is what? Extend mercy, right? Right? Beatitudes. What happens if we extend mercy? What happens what happens to the merciful? Blessed are they, what are they going to receive? Mercy. And this is what this man's finding out. And Jesus is talking to people who are literally on their road. They're on the highway. They're on the fast track, HOV, express lane to hell. And they're well studied in this. They're well versed in this. Probably spend more time than you and I reading and memorizing. Probably could quote more verses. But yet they don't know the words of the Master. They don't listen to the living God who is standing right there saying, you can't serve God and money. You're serving money. No, we're not serving money. We're just, we have to take care of ourselves in order, to give into the temple. We have to do this, got to do. No. Your priority is not God, it's yourself. And they're not hearing it. And Jesus gives them that last story of Lazarus as an example of what happens when we don't listen to his word. So the truth of the matter, church, is that we have a choice. Jesus he doesn't force himself upon us. And we can choose I can choose today whether I'm going to walk in what Christ tells me to walk. Because I'll tell you what, the world, everything, the battles that we face are very real. Perfectly okay to be afraid. I have a lot in my business. I was talking to actually, I need to call him right after we get done, one of my best friends. He's thinking about buying a house, and he's asking me, what should I do? What should I do? And I'm thinking to myself the whole time, I'm like, I'm definitely not God. Pray and ask God whatever, because if you do what God tells you to do, you're going to be okay. But sometimes what God tells us to do doesn't make sense. I went to language school before I went to Bible school. That doesn't make any sense. I was a missionary, and then after that I was a youth pastor. Well, that's not how it works. Then I went into business. That's definitely not God's way of doing things, right? I mean, God calls people out of business, then to be youth pastors, then work in the church a little bit, and then you go be a missionary. But no. See, we do things God's way. It works out according to his plan. And I've learned that God can give us words. He can tell us great things. I don't know about you, but I know God's got a promise for me, and I believe it. And it's a big promise. And it's one that I have a rough time with understanding how it's going to work out. And when I think about it, the Lord just tells me don't worry and not to be afraid, When I think about next year and all the changes, and I think about everything that's going on with the country, the Lord says don't worry about it, Doesn't make any sense. He says, I got this. And it doesn't make any sense, because I look at it and I say, man, there's a storm, but Lord, what about this, and that, and this, that? And God says, don't worry about all that, Think about it. And the Lord tells us not to worry about, told Peter, Peter called out to him and he said, Lord, if you call me out of this boat, I'll walk, and I'll walk on water. And when he gets to Jesus, Jesus is like, oh, why'd you look away? Disappointed that Peter didn't focus on him through the craziest circumstances in the world. And the thing is that Jesus is right. Jesus calls us to focus on him in spite of everything that we face. How do we overcome? If we start to think about that, that's a pretty heavy call. It's a pretty weighty call. And so what's the takeaway? What's the message? The crux is that we take the Lord at his word. We have a choice every day to apply God's word to our life, to apply God's principles, to be faithful or to not be faithful, to love or not to love, To love him or to love the things of this world? What are we in love with? You know, can I be in love with Jesus and in love with money? I can't. I'll tell you what, I've been working on a project. I'm probably guilty, just like the Pharisees are, of just worrying about the here and now instead of trusting in Jesus and sitting and just saying, okay, Lord, what in the world do you want me to do right now? Okay, Lord, you tell me to be merciful. How can I extend mercy in this situation? God, you tell me that I am blessed because I'm in a situation right now in what I do where I have some things held up and they're being held up by other people. And so things are out of my control. I hate that. I don't like things being out of my control. I like being my own boss because things aren't, I have a lot of control, a lot of say. So when things are out of your control and you're just waiting there, you have a choice. You can either doubt and you can let that doubt lead to sin, or you can ask, okay, Lord, what is it? What do you want me to do? Well, that is all that I have for tonight. It's 8:03. Let's bow our heads in prayer real quick.